she stops loud.
Bismillah.
You can adjust this.
Oh, no. Assalamu alaikum. Let me see here. All right. No, I'm not. Alhamdulillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا فمن يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله ثم أما بعد. Again, Assalamu alaikum. It's a great honor, a great privilege to be here. I'm actually very excited about today's class because this is our inaugural session of the Al-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyya wa al-Mustafawiyya, the famous book of Imam al-Tirmidhi. MashaAllah, I have a very beautiful translation of the book that the Al-Ghazali Institute produced this year. Alhamdulillah, I've participated in teaching this book at weekend programs maybe 8 or 9 times. MashaAllah. The entire collection contains about 415 hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, but some of them repeat. Nonetheless, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Nonetheless, doing that many narrations over the course of a weekend is very taxing, and you have to fit a lot in to those 45 or 55-minute windows that we get to teach. This, I plan on being much more relaxed. This book, the Al-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyya, is the most famous book of this genre, right? This is an entire genre of hadith collection, hadith about the physical description and the character and the personal affects of the Prophet ﷺ. Imam al-Tirmidhi's book is undoubtedly the most popular book, in the genre. And if you look at this book compared to the overall corpus of Imam al-Tirmidhi, you'll find that this book is much different in character. Imam al-Tirmidhi was trained by some of the greatest hadith scholars of his time, including Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim. And as a hadith classifier, meaning, authenticator, Imam al-Tirmidhi is one of the best. And he has a very idiosyncratic way of labeling the hadith. And if you look at his Sunan or his Jami', you'll see that. Here, he really doesn't engage in a lot of grading and classification. Later generations of scholars have concluded that the narrations used in this book are of the best that he knows. But this, you can tell, was much more devotional in character. This was a love letter. This was, this wasn't about academic rigor so much as it was about bringing the Prophet ﷺ into life in people's homes. Imam al-Tirmidhi said about this book, if you have this book in your home, it's like the Prophet ﷺ is in your home. And for those of us struggling to forge a relationship with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, we are removed from him by language, by time, space, by culture. This book will really help us to fill in some gaps, right? Because in this book, you have people who were there narrating their experience with the Prophet ﷺ. And of everything they narrate, what comes through perhaps most clearly is the fact that they absolutely loved this man. There was something about him that was absolutely endearing to people. And I think it's easy, and I've talked about this in the past, to read, into prior context, this kind of gullibility. These are just simple people that were just so gullible. And actually, these were people that had more reservations about embracing the Prophet ﷺ than you do. All of us either converted to Islam or were born into Muslim families. These were people that at one time might have thought this man's a charlatan. This man's a liar. This man's a soothsayer. This man's a magician. And these are the same people toward the end of the prophetic mission that are talking about how much they love him and how great his character was, how beautiful his smile was, how beautiful his face was. So these are people that were won over. And I think that's important to bear in mind as you read the Shama'il, right? Not people that like, we always, like a lot of us, we always had a certain devotion to the Prophet ﷺ, even if it was only a romantic notion that this is the messenger of God. These were people deeply in love, and that comes through the text. So I actually want to get right into it because I want to just relax with this class, man. We'll just go through very, very slowly and gently, and we'll take our time and we'll have conversation, right? And just very quickly, a biographical note about Imam at-Tirmidhi. He was from present-day Uzbekistan. That region, Central Asia, is the epicenter of hadith scholarship in Islamic history. All of the great muhaddithun are from Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Samarkand. They're from that region. And it just goes to show you, man, in many instances, the people that made the greatest contributions to Islamic scholarship were not people that were native Arabic speakers, not people that were Arabian, but people who later maybe became Arab through language. But, one gets the sense that maybe as the result of some, Arab nativism, Arabs like, this is our religion and having all of this kind of cultural pride. Non-Arabs acquitted themselves through study, through engagement with the sources, through mastery of language and exegesis and hadith. And you see that in fiqh. You see that certainly in Arabic. All of the great Arab grammarians are non-Arabs, right? And you also see that in hadith. Bismillah. So let's get right into this, man. Chapter 1. Babu ma ja'a fi khalqi Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. What has been narrated concerning the blessed physical features of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. One of the things that I think distinguishes our religion from Christianity is that Islam has great reservations about physical images. You don't see physical images in our spaces. Representational art doesn't even make up 5% of the artistic output of classical Muslim civilization. I mean, you'll get every now and again a Persian miniature, a Turkish miniature that maybe depicts the Prophet ﷺ, but his face is covered, and then there's like the blaze in the back of him. But the vast majority of the creative impulse of Muslims went into design like that, and also calligraphy, right? So, and I think that in not focusing on image making or tasweer, Muslims averted a major source of potential fitna. Because when you begin making images, the way you make those images will undoubtedly impact people's esteem, their sense of who they are, their sense of what is beautiful, their sense of what is ugly, their sense of what is divine, their sense of what perfection looks like, etc. So one of the things that gave me as a convert to Islam great comfort is that, you didn't see images everywhere of what prominent religious figures looked like. So you didn't have to worry about, are they white, are they black? Do they have curly hair, do they have straight hair? Do they have brown eyes, do they have blue eyes? You don't really see that. Nonetheless, and that's, I think, mashallah, Muslims dodged a bullet. Nonetheless, there was always great concern and engagement with the physical description of the Prophet ﷺ, right? And debate over the physical description of the Prophet ﷺ. Some people, and this is more so a contemporary argument, are at pains to point out that the Prophet was black. The Prophet was black. And then other people, like you see in our history, if someone says the Prophet is black, they're a disbeliever. right? You have that whole range of opinion, right? One thing I'd like to speak to about this, well, two things. One, talking about the ethnic background or physical attributes of the Prophet ﷺ, one must bear in mind that prophethood is a Wahbi phenomenon, meaning it's something that is given by God. And it's not given on the basis of merit, right? It's not for one to say Blackness is so great that Blackness has created inventors, Blackness has created great generals, great statesmen, great scientists, great warriors, great poets. Blackness has even created prophets, because Blackness doesn't create prophets. And the same thing can be said about Uruba or Arabness, that Arabness is so great that not only has Arabness created poets and warriors and statesmen and inventors and scientists, Arabness has created prophets. Arabness doesn't create prophets. God makes prophets. The second thing that you have to remember, the second thing that's important to remember about the Prophet ﷺ is something we all know. When people describe someone physically, they always describe them in context, right? So if I say, referencing African Americans, so-and-so is light-skinned, I don't mean that his skin is like someone Irish. I mean, he's a light-skinned African American, which might be like Ali's complexion or even Runda's complexion. I mean, like, they're light-skinned African American. Just like when Western European women describe a desirable man as tall, dark, and handsome, they're not talking about me. Right? They mean dark for a white person, like an Italian or a Portuguese person, or right. So when you read the descriptions of the Prophet ﷺ as light or white, or understand that these are descriptions of him given in context, meaning people like the Arabs are talking about how he looks as one of them, right? So it begins عن أنس ابن مالك أنه سمعه يقول كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ليس بالطويل البائن ولا بالقصير ولا بالأبيض الأمحق ولا بالآدم. So he begins, he says, the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم, well, I should read the entire narration. ولا بالجعد القطط ولا بالصبت بعثه الله تعالى على رأس 40 سنة فأقام بمكة 10 سنين وبالمدينة 10 سنين وتوفاه الله على رأس 60 سنة وليس في رأسه ولحيته 20 شعرة بيضاء. On the authority of Anas ibn Malik, who said, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was neither exceedingly tall nor short. He was neither extremely white nor dark brown in complexion. His blessed hair was neither extremely curly nor straight. Allah sent him forth with the prophetic message 40 years from his birth, after which he remained in Mecca for 10 years and in Medina for 10 years. Allah took his blessed soul at 60 years of age. And at that time, and at the time of his passing, there were no more than 20 white hairs in his blessed beard or head. Bismillah. So the first thing is that this hadith is narrated by Anas ibn Malik, who was a young errand boy of the Prophet alayhi salam. So when the Prophet came to Medina, of course, as is custom in many places, you present the visitor or the newly arrived guest, like you bring things to our neighbors with a gift. And the mother of Anas ibn Malik wanted to give the Prophet ﷺ a gift, but she found herself with no money. So she sent her son. This is my son Anas. Right? Sounds like my mom. Right? I don't have anything to give you, but I give you my son. If you need any errands, if there's anything you need done, just send him. Right? And this was very fortunate for Anas because this brought him into close proximity with the Prophet ﷺ as a little child. Right? When the Prophet passes away, Anas is only like 11 or 12 years of age, right? maybe 13, 14 years of age. He's still very, very young. One of the other very interesting things you see is that a lot of the physical descriptions of the Prophet ﷺ are given by the younger companions, children mostly, because they were able to engage him without a filter. Many of the adults among the Sahaba, they had such reverence for the Prophet ﷺ that they would like hold their heads down, or they wouldn't look him in the face, right? So you won't find them often describing him. Mostly his family members will describe him, and young children will describe him. Something else that's very interesting about Anas is that he also talks very passionately about the gentleness of the Prophet ﷺ. In one narration, and it seems like in this narration, he's scolding some of the parenting or some of the parents and some of their parenting techniques. In his time, he said, I used to run errands for the Prophet ﷺ, and I was a bad kid. He would send me on errands and I wouldn't even fulfill the errand that he gave me. And he never said to me, oof, he never said even a slight word of disapproval to me, ever. Ever. He said one time, the Prophet ﷺ told me, sent me on some task. And as I was on my way, I saw some children playing in the street. And I said to myself, I can do what the Prophet told me, or I can play with my friends. I think I'm gonna play with my friends. And he said he started playing in the street with his friends. And he said, all of a sudden as they were playing, everybody froze. And whatever was going on was taking place behind him. So he was still like playing like what's going, And he said that as soon as he felt the hand on his shoulder, he knew that it was the Prophet ﷺ. And he said he got scared. And he said the Prophet just took his body and turned him in the direction of the errand. And he said that when he turned back and looked at the Prophet ﷺ, he was smiling. Right? He just took him and said, all I told you to go this way. Right? He never said a word of disapproval, of censure, never, right? So we see here that the Prophet ﷺ is described as not extremely tall, nor extremely short. The Prophet ﷺ was marbu', which means he was 4 cubits tall. So the cubit is a length of measurement that we don't use, right? But it's like from your shoulder to the tip of your fingers, right? The Prophet ﷺ was 4, or is it the whole thing? I forget. I believe it's, no, it's just this. It's just this, that's a cubit. And the Prophet ﷺ was marbu'a, so he was 4 cubits tall. Sayyidina Umar was min ashab al-sudus. He was 6 cubits tall. So Sayyidina Umar was very tall. Sayyidina Umar was maybe 6'7", 6'8". The Prophet ﷺ was not very tall, but he was also not very short. One of the miraculous things that people said they would see when looking at him is that he would appear to tower over people, even though he wasn't very tall. Some people say there's a very practical way of explaining that the Sahaba would bend down when they were close to him. So he appeared to be towering over people, right? Because it said that they would sit very still and they would lean in when he spoke. Some people say it was just a mu'jiza, it was just a miracle. Even though he wasn't very tall, he appeared to be very tall. Kind of like a person that their gravitas gives them presence. There are certain people that even though they are short in stature, when you look at them, it's hard to imagine that they're short. Martin Luther King Jr. was only 5'7". But when you see like video footage of Martin Luther King Jr., that booming stentorian voice and that very distinct Georgia drawl, and he's the great orator, has great presence on the pulpit, you imagine him to be bigger. But he's actually quite a small person, right? It says here, وَلَا بِالْأَبْيَضِ الْأَمْحَقِ, that the Prophet, he wasn't pale. He wasn't extremely white in his complexion. And they mean even for an Arab, he wasn't extremely white in his complexion, right? They used to call Europeans, the Romans, ahmar, red, right? So they would describe themselves as either abyad or asmar, white or light brown. But people that were European, they would say ahmar, red, because they had a ruddiness, they had a redness that came through their complexion, right? So it says here the Prophet ﷺ wasn't extremely white. Wala bil Adam. A lot of you probably don't know this, but the word Adam means extremely brown. So yes, Adam alayhi salam, right? His name is Adam because he's fashioned from dirt. That's why his name is Adam. Even Adam also refers to dirt. Soil is Adam, right? If we call someone very dark-skinned, we say shadidul udma. They're very dark-skinned. Or say ghamik, they're swarthy, right? So they says the Prophet ﷺ was not Adam. He was not extremely dark-skinned. But Adam ﷺ was extremely dark-skinned. That's why his name is Adam. You see, right? But the Prophet ﷺ was not extremely dark-skinned. And it says, وَلَا بِالْجَعَدِ الْقَطَتِ, and he didn't have very curly hair. His hair was not extremely curly, right? وَلَا بِالصَّبْتِ, but his hair was not lank either. It wasn't extremely lank. Now, what you will notice is that even in the way people describe the Prophet ﷺ, you're picking up on a theme here. The theme is balance, it's in the middle. Everything, every time I read these descriptors, I'm like, basically what they're saying is he's kind of perfectly, he wasn't extremely pale, he wasn't extremely dark. He wasn't very tall, he wasn't very short. His hair wasn't very curly, it wasn't very straight. And you get the sense that they're saying like his inward kind of balance is reflected in his outward balance, right? He was in the middle, right? Now, another interesting point in this hadith, بَعَثَهُ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى عَلَى رَأْسِ 40 سَنَةً. Allah dispatched him or sent him as a messenger at the age of 40. فَأَقَامَ بِمَكَّةَ 10 سِنِينَ, and he stayed in Mecca for 10 years. Now, most of us understand that the Prophet ﷺ stayed in Mecca for 13 years and Medina for 10 years. In a lot of these narrations, they round their numbers up or round them down, right? But to the nearest 5, not the nearest 10, right? They round them up or they round them down, right? One of the modern conveniences that we totally take for granted is precise time taking. Like even when Ramadan comes around, the Muslims are like, what time is Maghrib? 7:54. I'm like, I know Sayyidina Abu Bakr never said that a day in his life. They never said, what time is Maghrib? 7:56. Like that is the time of sunset, right? At that time, it was actually rare for people to know their precise birthdays. A lot of people did not know their birthdays. If you would have asked someone, what day were you born? I mean, I actually still remember when some African Americans born in rural areas didn't know their ages. If you ask them, like, how old are you? Well, 63, 65, something like that. No, I'm dead serious. I'm not making this up. My grandfather was born in the kitchen and never went to the hospital to get a birth certificate. Was delivered by kind of a, de facto midwife, right? Never went to the hospital to get a birth certificate and only had to declare his age when he was registering for the U.S. Army. And so when we would ask him, how old are you? I told him I was 20, but I might have been 24. I don't know. And that became his age. I told him I was 20. So one of the modern conveniences we take for granted is like very precise time measuring. That wasn't a part of the ancient world. So for them, when they say he was in Mecca for 10, he was in Medina for 10, they're saying like basically something like 10 years in Mecca, something like 10 years in Medina, something like that, right? Then the last part, وَلَيْسَ فِي رَأْسِهِ وَلِحْيَتِهِ 20 شَعْرَةً بَيْضَاءَ, and he didn't have, when he died, in his beard, 20 gray hairs, or in his head. Every time I read that, I think to myself, who counts someone's gray hairs? This is how they loved the Prophet ﷺ. This is how closely Anas was watching him, right? Even someone that I watch very closely, I could not tell you how many gray hairs they have, I'm sure. Right? I could not tell you, oh, he has about, I don't know, 7, 8 gray hairs, something like that. He said he didn't have any more than 20 gray hairs at the time of his death, right? Next hadith, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Again, عن أنس ابن مالك قال كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ربعة ليس بالطويل ولا بالقصير حسن الجسم وكان شعره ليس بجعد ولا صبت أسمر اللون إذا مشى يتكفى. On the authority of Anas ibn Malik, who reported, the Messenger of Allah ﷺ was of medium stature, neither exceedingly tall nor short. He had a handsome physique. His blessed hair was neither extremely curly nor straight. His complexion was fair, with some asmar, with some redness. When he walked, he would walk swiftly with vigor and lean forward slightly. You know, the only thing new we get in this hadith is asmar al-lawn. Asmar is like kind of like Runda's complexion, actually. It's like asmar al-lawn is like that, like you know, a very qamhi, wheat colored, very light brown. He also says in this hadith, إِذَا مَشَى يَتَكَفَّى, when the Prophet walked, he would incline forward. Right? Two things, you know, the walk of the Prophet ﷺ was very, very distinct. And when people in Mecca, some of the detractors of the Prophet ﷺ would make fun of him, they would make fun of his walk. This was one of the things they would mock him about. So they would take turns mocking him, and they would say, "Who am I?" It was Muhammad ﷺ. You know, on one occasion they called him Muhammad. Right? Muhammad means the one worthy of praise. Muhammad means the one worthy of blame. And someone was ridiculing the Prophet ﷺ in jest, lampooning him in poetry. But they were saying Muhammad. And one of the companions were really, really hurt by this. Like, oh man, how can you say this about the Prophet ﷺ? And the Prophet said, isn't it amazing how Allah has protected me from their slander? He said, huh? They're talking about somebody named Muhammad. My name is Muhammad. They're not even talking about me, right? They're talking about somebody else, right? But it's mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ, and for people tuning in on Zoom, they won't be able to see me do it. But it's mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ, when he walked, he would kind of lean forward. So his walk was, and the companions mentioned that when we were walking alongside the Prophet ﷺ, we found it very hard to keep pace with him. He walked very fast. Right? They said sometimes we would be walking with the Prophet ﷺ, we would be exhausted, and he would be walking with vigor. One thing I've heard said about this that resonated with me. This is the walking style of a man or a woman on a mission. You see, someone sitting back like this, I see they ain't got nowhere to go. Man, what's good, man? Yeah, I'm a laid back kind of guy in a laid back kind of world. You know what I mean? I'm chilling. But the Prophet ﷺ, he had a mission. He had somewhere to go. He had tasks that he needed to perform. So he walked and he inclined forward slightly. Right? عن أبي إسحاق قال سمعت البراء ابن عازب يقول كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم رجلا مربوعا بعيد ما بين المنكبين عظيم الجمة إلى شحمة أذني عليه حلة حمراء ما رأيت شيئا قط أحسن منه. Shu'bah narrated to us on the authority of Abu Ishaq, who said, I heard Bara ibn Azib say, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was a man of medium stature. His blessed shoulders were broad. He had a full head of hair that would reach to his blessed earlobes. He was wearing 2 red garments. I have never seen anything more beautiful than him. MashaAllah. Bara ibn Azib, who was also young at the time, he mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ had broad shoulders, right? The Prophet ﷺ was physically very, very strong. He was very, very strong. But that strength was balanced with great gentleness. He was a very gentle person. Aisha, radiallahu anha, she said, I never saw the Prophet ﷺ raise his hand to anyone except defending the integrity of the community on the battlefield. I never saw him express frustration, threaten anybody, raise, not only to anyone, but to anything. I never saw him strike an animal out of frustration. Never. He was very, very gentle, very loving and very approachable. But physically, he was very, very strong. You know, once it's mentioned in Sirah, it's a story in the Sirah of the Prophet ﷺ, that when they were building the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ, they came to a place when they were digging this huge boulder that they were going to need to pulverize in order to move it, or 2 or 3 men were going to have to get down there and pick it and get it out of the hole as they created the foundation for the masjid. And they say the Prophet ﷺ took the shovel and struck the rock and pulverized the rock, and flashes came out of the rock. And he said to them, those flashes represent the kingdoms of Byzantium and Persia and the Sahaba. You know, one of the things that I think about when the Prophet was telling them these things, that this is going to happen with this ummah, as they were just a beleaguered minority in Mecca being persecuted. All of this must have sounded very unbelievable to them. What? Kingdoms? We can barely stay alive. People are killing us with impunity. No. He said to Suraka ibn Malik, you will enter the king of Persia's court and his crown will be placed on your head. And Suraka was in rags. You know, it would sound like, yeah, nice one, nice pickup, Rasulullah. Right, nice pickup. And sure enough, shortly after the demise of the Prophet ﷺ, they entered the kingdom of the king of Persia, and the crown was placed on the head of Suraka. And he started weeping because the Prophet ﷺ told him this. But the point of this hadith is that the Prophet had broad shoulders and he was very strong. And he said, Al-mu'minu al-qawiyyu khayrun min al-mu'min al-da'ifi, that the strong believer is better than the weak believer, right? But he also said that strength is not characterized by being able to throw somebody to the ground. There was a man named Doroba who was a great wrestler. In fact, he was widely renowned as a wrestler. And once he was walking through Mecca, this is before the Hijrah, and the Prophet ﷺ said to him, half jokingly, half seriously, if I can put you on your back, will you bear witness that there's nothing worthy of worship besides Allah? And Doroba said, if you can put me on my back, there's nothing worthy of worship except Allah. And you must be his messenger, because nobody in X amount of years has ever put me on my back. And the Prophet ﷺ said, you ready? And Doroba said, I'm ready. And the Prophet grabbed him, slammed him. I love this story. he slammed him, put him on his back. And then Doroba said, wait, I wasn't ready. Let's go again. Prophet grabbed him, slammed him again. He said, wait, hold on, you caught me off guard. No, I'm ready now, Slammed him a third time. And then he said to him, Doroba, the strong man is not the man who can throw people on the ground, but the man who can control himself. And Doroba became Muslim, right? So this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, about the strong believer being better than the weak believer, we have to interpret it in light of that hadith, that story, so that we don't all rush to the gym thinking, I got to get there. Although many scholars say both meanings are true, that it is good to be physically strong, right, for women and men, but ultimate strength is in self-control, right? But it is good to be physically strong. He says, عَظِيمَ الْجُمَّةِ إِلَى شَحْمَةِ أُذُنَيْهِ, that the Prophet ﷺ had a nice full head of hair. These are those sunnah that I will never be able to embrace, unless I get with Brian Urlacher and the billboards I see up there. And I said, maybe I should get it back, his sunnah, But he had a jumma, which means he had a very nice head of hair. But you know what, I'll tell you, man. I've grown to learn that it's better to appreciate what you have than to long for what you don't, right? I always wanted a big beard. I wanted a big beard, well maintained, one of those Duck Dynasty joints, you know what I'm saying? And my beard won't grow more than this. I don't know what it is. I think maybe Allah Ta'ala is sparing me from arrogance or something like that. I don't know, right? My beard won't go. And the thing about it, I had to go to school with Desi guys that were so hirsute, which means that's the proper word for hairy. I remember, I'm not kidding. There was a brother that I went to school with at the madrasa. He was 14. He already had a beard. I said, how can you grow a beard at 14? He already had a beard. He was like 14, he had a beard. Assalamu alaikum Khalid, right? But it wasn't until one day I was at Azhar and I saw an Indonesian brother. He had two strings, one hair like this, one hair like this. And he was going like this. And I looked at him and I just kind of laughed and he said, Sunnah. He had two strings. Sunnah. And I said, you know what? Alhamdulillah, I'll take what I got, man. It's not much, but I'll deal with it. The Prophet ﷺ wore his hair in many different styles. Sometimes he would wear his hair down to his earlobes. Other times he would wear his hair to his shoulders. Sometimes he would wear his hair braided. Particularly in battle, he would wear his hair braided to four braids. One there, one there, one there, one there. Sometimes he wears hair braided. Right? Then this hadith ends, he says, مَا رَأَيْتُ شَيْئًا قَدْتُ أَحْسَنَ مِنْ. I have never seen anything more beautiful than the Prophet ﷺ. And, one of the things I think, if you want to kind of get into the spirit of these riwayat, the spirit of these narrations, you have to remember that the Arab of that time very much had a culture of machismo. They very much had a culture that made it unacceptable for men to gush over other men like that. That was not something that was a regular part of their experience. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ, and I don't want to put too sharp a point on this, but the Prophet intentionally deconstructed certain notions of their masculinity, right? Intentionally. So like the hadith that you read about the young man who has 10 children, right? And he's talking to the Prophet ﷺ. As he's talking to the Prophet ﷺ, a young boy comes up to ask a question. In the course of listening to him, the Prophet rubbed his head and just gave him a kiss on the head. And the man said, "You kiss children?" Like that was almost like it offended the man's sensibilities. Like, you kiss kids? The man said, "I have 10 children and I've never kissed one of them." And the Prophet said to him, alayhi, "Yes, I kiss children, and you should kiss your children." And then he said, "What do I have in this deen for someone that has had mercy removed from their heart? Like, what benefit will you find in Islam if you're a man that finds it offensive to kiss children? How will deen help you?" Right? It was a custom among the Arabs that men rode stallions or they rode camels. If they were going on long journeys, they rode camels. If they were going on shorter journeys, they rode stallions, they rode horses. But women rode donkeys and mules. right? Sometimes the Prophet ﷺ would ride through the city of Medina on a mule. And, you know, the Sahib would be like, the Prophet ﷺ is driving a Honda? You know, it's like, you know, or some car, you know, men know, the men in the room know there are certain cars that we think, yeah, that's nice, but that's not a man's car. I wouldn't, yeah, it's not a man. It's a nice car, but that's not a man's car. The Prophet ﷺ was driving that car, if we were to contemporize the example, right? Like men ride stallions, or we ride camels. Men don't ride mules. Children ride mules. Women ride mules. The Prophet ﷺ would ride a mule. And dare someone to say, what, is there a problem? Yeah, I'm driving it. Is there a problem? Right? So when you read a man saying about the Prophet ﷺ, مَا رَأَيْتُ شَيْئًا قَطُّ أَحْسَنَ مِنْهُ, I have never seen anything more beautiful than him. This is something that he's saying because he loves the Prophet ﷺ. Not like, you know, we always talk like this. In fact, they had a culture that frowned on that kind of expression. Even, you know, the famous hadith where one man says to the Prophet ﷺ about another, you know, I love that, I love him, I love that guy. And the Prophet said, have you ever told him that you love him? No, you know, I wouldn't, no, you don't do that. The Prophet said, well, you must tell him. You have to tell him that you love him, right? Love can't be held but not expressed. You should tell him that you love him, right? So the Prophet ﷺ very much encouraged this culture that we're experiencing in this text. Fourth hadith, Bismillah. عن براء بن عازب قال ما رأيت من ذي لمة في حلة حمراء أحسن من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم له شعر يضرب منكبيه بعيد ما بين المنكبين لم يكن بالقصير ولا بالطويل. On the authority of Bara ibn Azib, again, I have never seen anyone whose hair reached between his earlobes and shoulders while wearing two red garments more beautiful than the Messenger of Allah. He had some hair that reached down to his blessed shoulders. His blessed shoulders were broad. He was neither short nor tall. So again, Bara is talking about the Prophet ﷺ wearing these two red garments. And these red garments will come up a few times in these hadith. The Prophet's favorite garments were garments of Yemeni construction, right? Yemeni manufacturing. And the clothes of the Prophet ﷺ will come up, but mostly the Prophet wore unstitched clothes. He had a shirt, right? And he would sometimes wear his shirt, but mostly his favorite was the izar, which is like the lungi, right? And the rida, which is like, you know what? Like what you see people wearing for Hajj. You know the ihram? That was actually how they dressed all the time. The ihram was just special. It was just it was reserved for a special occasion. But the Prophet's daily dress was like the ihram. Something over the lower extremity and then something covering the shoulders, right? This is how you make sense of those hadith that when he would prostrate, we could see his armpit because he's mostly just wearing like something over his shoulders. He has a stitched shirt, but you know, that he would wear regularly, but the mantle, right, the rida, was the more regular dress of the Prophet ﷺ, right? And you know, he wasn't afraid to wear color. So some people who say men wearing bold colors, this is an imitation of women, and you can't do this. And no, the Prophet ﷺ wore the color red. Although they say these garments were like tinged in red. They weren't like bold red. They were like coral, almost like tinged, you know, in red. But Bismillah, we'll stop there. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. We'll stop there and we'll leave 30 minutes for discussion, inshallah. But we covered 4 hadith and we have 411 to go. Alhamdulillah. But we've always done very long books, you know, in this class, mashallah. So any questions, ideas, comments? MashaAllah. Alhamdulillah. Well, I'm happy to be back too. Well, the questions can be about anything else. They don't have to be about what we covered today. What we covered today was pretty straightforward. Yes. Go ahead, Bismillah. Mm-hmm. There is a longer version. It also occurs in this book. Yeah, there's a longer version. Yeah, mashallah. Are you talking about the 8th hadith? Then look at 8. 8 is the longer version. You see, 8 is the longer version. Other questions? The hilya is where, you know, someone who is a wasaf, someone who specializes in describing people is describing the Prophet, right? You know, physical descriptions is interesting. You know, if someone doesn't do it often, then of course the descriptions they give are very generic. Someone says, "How does she look?" Tall, you know, 5'6", 5'7", brown face, regular nose, regular forehead, wearing glasses. That's like a, but someone who specializes in describing people, maybe like one of those people who work for the FBI that does sketches, you know, the way they would describe a person, from their hair to their sloping forehead with an aquiline nose, with a jaw that was elongated, with a wispy mustache, receding hairline, with so the hilya is when someone who specializes in physical descriptions describes the Prophet, right? So of course, these are usually the most riveting, the most evocative descriptions, because it's done by someone who really knows how to describe somebody, right? However, when we describe people that we love, we're usually very, very detail oriented, right? We don't just say, oh, you know, ask someone to describe the man or woman they are in love with. Oh, you know, she was 5'6.5". She's 5'6.5" with, you know, these kinds, you know, eyes that are like almonds and a mouth that is kind of bow-shaped, and when she laughs, her dimples, you know, that's like a much more flavorful description. And the hilya is that flavorful description of the Prophet, right? These were actually quite generic, actually, compared to the hilya, right? Compared to the hilya, the description that we cover today are like, you know, very, very generic. Right? Other questions? Yes, Khalid.
Not to make any sort of analogy there, but you might notice the long portraits are here in the city, and just the idea of a portrait of Shama'il and what it stands for. I see it or
We actually tried to get tickets for today, but they're sold out actually. Yeah, I mean, okay, alhamdulillah, I'm glad we're talking after class. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. MashaAllah. You know, a portrait, you know, portraiture is a highly subjective art form. And there's so much you can capture about a person through their posture, through their mien, M-I-E-N, like their facial expression, through their clothing, through I mean, the true portrait artist has an unlimited amount of devices at their disposal to convey to the viewing audience what they want to convey about this person: dignity or shyness or mystery. I mean, the Mona Lisa, which is probably the most famous portrait, in the world, is esteemed because it appears open to so many different interpretations. Is it a smirk? Is it a smile? Is it coyness? Is it shyness? Is it provocation? Is it, it's right? Because, Da Vinci, has at his disposal so many different devices to convey what he wants to convey about this young woman. Shama'il is kind of like going into the mind of someone that is painting a portrait, but without the physical picture, right? So I remember hearing about Shama'il sessions in which the teacher would be sitting in front of the students, eyes tightly closed, reciting the Shama'il from memory, trying to visualize the Prophet ﷺ according to what was being recited, according to what was being read. You see what I'm saying? So in a sense, I mean, this is a mental portrait that is being painted of the Prophet ﷺ. It's also worth noting that, even though the strongest narration states that when we go into our graves, we'll be asked who our Lord is. We'll be asked what our faith is. And then we will be asked, what do you say about Muhammad? But in one riwayah, one recension of that hadith, you will be shown a picture of the Prophet ﷺ in your grave. What do you say about this man? Right? So knowing the Shama'il, you will know immediately who that is. Oh, that's Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. I know who that is, right? But if you don't know the Shama'il, you may say, wait, is that the guy from around the corner? Is that the guy from the Mediterranean restaurant? Or you have to know the Shama'il in order to say, that's the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, right? And there are things, and also too, people that think about like seeing the Prophet ﷺ in a dream. There's different like ways of experiencing the Prophet ﷺ in a dream. Sometimes you're absolutely sure that it's him because you have a feeling. I've only seen the Prophet ﷺ in a dream one time, only once. Once I was asleep in the masjid, and I had a dream that I was asleep in the masjid. It's crazy, right? I had a dream that I was asleep in the masjid. And in the dream, I got up and I looked toward the minbar, and it was just light, like blinding light coming from the minbar. And I felt that it was the presence of the Prophet ﷺ, but I couldn't look. The light was, I didn't see, all I saw was light. And then I woke up. And when I woke up, I was like, man, I was in the space that I was dreaming about. But of course, without the light and everything, right? This other time, I had a dream that I was walking with my best friend. We were walking like in a desert type region. And I saw from a distance one man leading a group of people in prayer. And I made up my mind to join the prayer. Like, oh man, they're praying. We need to pray. And as I got closer, my heart started to beat faster. And lo and behold, when I got close enough that I could see who it was the Prophet ﷺ. I was blown away. Just seeing him was so intense that I woke up immediately. And I was out of breath for, probably 5 minutes. I could not, and that's the only things that have ever happened to me. So I know some people, they see the Prophet ﷺ in a dream every night. I don't. I had two experiences, but they were very, very impactful, experiences. But it was my familiarity with the Shama'il that even after I woke up, I was confirmed that yes, that was the Prophet ﷺ that I saw in that dream, right? And it was weird because I was with my best friend, and we were walking, And I said, oh man, somebody's praying. And it was like, as you got closer and closer, it's like, oh my God, what? That's not just somebody that's praying. That's the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, the thing that I have to reconcile in my fiqh is that when I saw the Prophet in the dream, he was praying like this. I don't know what I'm gonna do with that joy, you know what I'm saying? I swear to God. You know, I was like, yo, I'm Maliki, you know what I mean? I actually put my hands to my side. When I saw the Prophet in the dream, he was praying like this. I said, oh man, what does that mean? I said, what does that mean, bro? What? That joint jammed me up. I was like, I saw the Prophet in a dream. He was praying. He was praying cupped. He had his hands folded. I was like, SubhanAllah. I mean, I still pray with my hands on my side, but I don't know. I don't know. You know what I mean? SubhanAllah. Yeah. MashaAllah. Other questions, reflections, ideas? Oh, let's see. No. Yes.
When you were talking about one of the hadith, you said that the Ummah was saved from a lot of fitna for us not having a portrait of the Prophet ﷺ. And I'm curious if you want to expand a little bit upon that, because when you said that, I sort of, in my mind, I was triggered by like how our understandings of romance, success, whatever, are enhanced by
imagery.
So I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, and I think that image making. I find this eye-opening that Muslim legal scholars, no matter where they came down on the question, always regarded image making with great seriousness. Like for one to take it upon himself or herself to craft an image, one has essentially assumed one of the names of Allah Ta'ala, al-Musawwir. Allah is the one that gives the images. Allah is the one that gives the images. This is one of the reasons that modern scholars are moving toward a consensus about photography. Because in photography, no one is crafting an image. You're not making something. You're just capturing the image the way Allah actually made the image. Now, you can do things with a photo as Snapchat has shown us, right? As you can do things, right? But the idea about a photograph is this is the person as God has created them, but you're just capturing that, right? Same thing with television. That's the actual person being beamed through some kind of cathode ray tube and broadcast to other people. Making an image, it includes the subjective opinions, thoughts, feelings of the image maker, right? So much can happen there. I mean, yes, a lot of our ideas of those essential aspects of our lives are enhanced through imagery, but a lot of the toxic kinds of self-serving, other obliterating ideologies like white supremacy are also sustained through image making, right? I mean, Gramsci, the Italian Marxist theorist, he said that the real power of the capital class is not sustained simply through them owning the means of production, but also through them owning the means of image production, right? That they can craft images of themselves that, convince people of the worthiness of their position, right? So whether it's the wealthy philanthropist that is image making is a very it's a very serious matter, and I think that if people made religious images of the Prophet ﷺ, and we have descriptions of the Prophet ﷺ, but if you had images of Jesus, images of the Prophet, images of Moses, images of Yusuf, I think the effect of this ultimately would probably be more harmful than good. That does make things challenging a bit for Muslim storytellers, right? Especially playwrights, filmmakers. That's why I think it's best not to do reenactments. Like, I mean, all of us love the message. I mean, one Muslim hasn't seen the message, right? But I think to put together stories that are inspired by Quranic stories that feature other people, I think is a way kind of around that. And it forces people to kind of focus on the theme as opposed to having someone act as the Prophet or act as, Yusuf alayhi salam, right? But rather taking those stories, contemporizing them and having people act those themes. I think that might be a way that Muslim storytellers and filmmakers and playwrights can get around some of that, some of that prohibition. But yeah, image making is very, very serious. Very, very serious. I mean, when I think about some of the most serious political debates we're currently having in this country, a lot of those debates are based not on real experiences that people have with any group. Most of us live in echo chambers. It's based on images. When you say a conservative, when you say Trump supporters, MAGA people, how many of us really have people that we work with, live with, eat with, work out with, that really belong to those groups so that we actually have a human touch point when we're talking about liberals, conservatives, pro-choicers, pro-lifers. I mean, some of us do, but most of us actually don't. And most of the experiences we have with these various groups, they're usually quite civil. I mean, if it's at work or the gym or whatever, it's like me and this person, we don't agree politically, but But when you are really engaged with their image, somebody is crafting some news outlet is crafting an image of a liberal. Fox News and Tucker Carlson is crafting an image of a liberal. That's really what people are talking about, just the image. CNN is crafting an image of a conservative. That's really what people are talking about. You know what I'm saying? So I feel like, and even though that might be necessary, recognizing the grave seriousness of image making, like when you take it upon yourself to make an image, you really, you've set yourself up almost as someone that's serving as an intermediary between this person and God's creation. However you see it, it's almost like if I'm looking at an animal in the wild, I'm looking at it. I mean, it is what it is. Maybe it's a bear. It might be ferocious, but it could also look majestic. I mean, I can see that image in many different ways. Khalid and you were talking about this last time you were at my house. I can see that in many different ways, that bear. But once I concretize the way that I see it in a representational picture, right, in an oil painting, whatever I want to convey about that bear, maybe it's ferocity, maybe it's majesty. The person looking is not looking at a real bear. They're looking at my bear. So if they're left with the view that bears are these ferocious animals, then that's the image that I made. You understand what I'm saying? That's the image that I made. So image making is it's a very grave thing when you think about it. It's very serious to make an image. When you make an image, like I said, you're coming between someone and their experience of God's creation as it really is. You're giving them, this is what I want you to see of God's creation. This is what I want you to see. And maybe you want them to see something good. Maybe you want them to see something bad. Yeah, I don't know if I'm making myself clear, Other questions, ideas? Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. What do you guys think, man? Think we can get through it? Alhamdulillah. And I just take some, sessions like this, they can go on for a while. And if people can kind of commit, oh man, as you get toward the end, there's an amazing camaraderie and momentum that's built. Like, Hadith 412, 13, like, man, we're about to complete the entire Al-Shama'il, man. And inshallah, if people come every day, I'll sign you an ijazah that you can then teach the Shama'il. If you come every day, I'll sign you an ijazah. Other comments, questions, ideas? Okay, we can stop there, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim al-Asr. إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. آمين يا رب العالمين. سبحان ربي رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Thank you all for coming. MashaAllah. You got to serve as the example of the promised complexion. Alhamdulillah.